Hey, how's it going, you guys? Thanks for joining me today. And we are going to take a look at part 2 build video of the WPL C-34KM. When I left you off last, I was speaking about the chassis being complete and questioning the 4-link up front and the way they told us to assemble it. But they are correct. You do not need a ball end up top. So when everything's said and done, that should be missing. Of course, this is the front, this is the rear. There's only one bottom link, so that's my bad. I apologize. Like I said, I'm learning along with you guys. This is a little more of a complex pit, and so let's get right at it. We're going to shoot on to what they say is the complicated part, which I guess I'll agree. They do have shims to shim up the gears once everything's said and done, if the gear mesh isn't right, which that's nice. So I'm going to say the front axle is the more complicated one because it actually has more bearings and pivot points, and then we'll move on to the rear axle. Since the links are so adjustable and it's going to be more of a personal preference, probably just going to go ahead and assemble the axles and go ahead and assemble the drive shafts, and we'll leave the links up for you guys to decide. So just going through in order on the instructions, we'll knock out the front axle, then the rear, and then we'll walk through the axles real fast because it can get tricky. Sometimes the easiest part on these kits can be what you would consider the most trickiest part or time consuming. I do have the front axle laid out in front of us, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with that. They do provide lube, but I'm going to go ahead and use that plus a little bit thinner stuff, so that way I know the bearings have lube inside of them. Maybe probably 3-in-1 grease or something like that. And just so we take steps forward and not back, I'm not going to Loctite this yet. Mainly because of how much wiggle room there is. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it a little loose and get the bearings slid on there, get everything in place, and see how much gear mesh we have working with. So once you think you have everything in place, you can't slide forward or back. Now I'm going to Loctite that since I know this is going to be its home. Okay, now that that grub screw is Loctited, we're going to grab these and push our bearings in, which of course are the biggest bearings. And if you have a problem pushing some of your stuff in, go ahead and scrape some of the paint away. Just double check and make sure that that's what needs to be done, because it's almost like there's no going back if you shim too much off. But it popped in. But, you know, yours may be a little different. And of course, once you have both of those assembled, set them off to the side. And this is what I'm going to go ahead and do. I'm going to push these bearings down so we can take a look and see what our gear mesh is, because this is the point we want to add spacers if we need to, as opposed to clamping the axle together and then having to take it all back apart to add spacers. We want to be able to see what the gear mesh clearance is. Sweet. Now I don't know if I got lucky, but that gear mesh is next to perfect. If you were wondering, you were going to want to pop this main gear off, and then of course your spacers would go on this gear to push it closer towards the gear on your axle. So since everything at this point seems to be okay, I'm going to go ahead and apply my grease and my lube to the bearings and of course the gear. This is definitely something you couldn't do without bearings. With the plastic bushing, so that's nice. definitely enjoy the build of this kit and how it definitely comes with better parts. So when putting the tips on, definitely make sure you see how far that's sliding in, because you want to bite down on all of that flat spot. Then once you see you are grabbing hold of all that flat spot, then go ahead and put your Loctite on and run your grub screw in. Alright, once those are secure and you got them locked down, then go ahead and slide these in through your bearings and then put the top down on the axle. Alright, so it should go slide that in, and they have these little gold bushings that slide down. You just line your hole up, and of course put Loctite on these screws, because when everything's said and done, the screw will need to pivot. Don't run it in too tight. So that way, Loctite on the tip of that screw will prevent it coming out on the trail. Definitely plan on running this thing through its paces and giving it a pretty good test. So okay, when your front axle is pretty much assembled, close to being done, my camera will focus. Pour some lube in there, and then now you can adjust your front steering link to connect the two. One thing I did think was interesting, you guys, is they show I think that's drag bar mounting at the bottom, and then right here, if you can see, they show it mounted on the top. So of course it'll be better on top, but it's whatever works best for you. It's more of a personal preference. I just wanted to show you guys that. So with the front axle complete, we are gonna slide what the links mount to right on top. And of course this is what your panhard bar eventually ends up mounting to. Of course, you take one of these finer threaded longer screws. I always start everything with my finger. Once it starts going down, there's these little metal back plating pieces. So those are going to slide up on the bottom. You'll feel the screw go down in it and get tighter. So this, of course, you're going to use the same screws that hold down the top of your link. Remember, the front axle is only a one link. So you're only going to use one golden ball, which is what we have left here. When your links are complete and ready. Alright, so other than the links, this axle is complete. Crazy turning angle. And on to the rear axle, which is exactly the same and should be a little easier. So starting on the rear axle, the one thing I noticed, they show the notch favoring the right hand side, but the notch, it actually needs to be flipped. The notch has to favor this side because your gear's favoring this side. On this vehicle, because of the way the motor and transfer case work, your pumpkins are on the same side. Now usually your front pumpkin would be on the left, and then your back pumpkin would have to be on the right, because if your back pumpkin was on the left, then your back tires would go forward and your front tires would go backwards. So it's a common problem you see. Usually you just have to swap one axle 180 degrees, just flip it. But on this kit, both the axles, or the pumpkins, are on the same side. So definitely note that down, that this needs to be flipped when installing the gear, or else nothing's going to line up. You won't have enough meat coming out for your flat spot or any of this to bite onto. So it's quite noticeable. But other than that, you should get to this stage where you can roll it. And what was interesting about this axle is once it is assembled, there's little lockers that slide through and lock the top and the bottom together. So I thought that was pretty cool and interesting at the same time. Now, just like on the front axle, make sure you can peek down there and make sure you're biting down on all that flat spot. But at the same time, don't mash up against this bearing too much. Give it a tiny little bit of wiggle room. And then, of course, Loctite. Of course, just like the front axle, you have everything spinning freely, and you can smash down the top of the axle. Make sure everything still spins freely. Just keep checking it every time you add something to it. And once the axle is smashed together, these have a key on them to where they can only fit one way. Just turn it until you feel it lock, and then push it on. Pretty scale looking axle. Alright, so just like the front axle, there's these metal clips that go into the bottom, and that's what the screw actually bites into. So the same screws that hold your pumpkin on shoot down here and bite into those. So that's the rear axle complete, minus the balls that go in between the brace, the axle brace. Those are right there. Once you do the links, you'll slide those in, your links, and slide your links in and take the longest screw and run through both of them. So, not bad. Pretty scale looking detail on there. Everything went together pretty well so far. I didn't really have to force anything. Of course, it's always nice to run your screw down into a metal thread and back out before you actually run the screw in for the first time. It's just going to make it easier. And last, we're going to run through real fast the axles. Now, if you assembled an MIP axle or any CVD axle, you kind of understand. The locking pins go in, you slide that in, and then the pin shoots through that, and the spring is holding the pin from backing out. So, take one of those, slide it through like that. And one of these, push it in, get yourself a tiny set pin, then you line the holes up, push it straight through, and then of course once you have the pin in its hole and it's locked, you slide the spring over, which can be a little difficult. Alright, so after stabbing my finger a couple of times with the flathead screwdriver, she's on there pretty good. Then you just cock it at an angle and shove it in. These are extremely long drive shafts, so hopefully the angles aren't too extreme. So that'll do it for this part. Thank you guys very much for watching. And I guess next time we're gonna have her on the trail. She should be complete. So hopefully this video helped you guys out a lot. Thank you very much. And can't wait to give her a test. Definitely gonna put her on the rocks and put her through the limits. More to come.